This is part 2. This segment will deal with how viral infections upregulate inflammation and how that inflammation is made substantially worse by other metabolic comorbidities that you may have, such as high blood sugar, kidney problems, and other health issues. Hi, I'm Dr. Bob Smith. Welcome to part 2 of inflammation and specifically how it relates to viral infections. Today we're going to go over the different aspects of what we know now about viruses based on the information that has evolved over the last 5, 10, 15 years since actually the advent of the information that begins almost in the 1980s where HIV became such a problem. Since then, a great deal of information has been learned about the mechanics of intracellular activity and also how our body attempts to defend against viral infections. Many of the different components of these patterns we'll go over, but some of them are just worth mentioning now. Toll-like receptors are part of the 13 different adaptive things that have been identified that allow for your cell, specifically in most cases white blood cells, to identify the presence of substances that are deemed to be inflammatory in nature. When you see reactive oxygen stress, it's important to understand that that's associated with the metabolic activities surrounding, in most cases, the mitochondria inside the cell. When you start finding pattern recognition receptors, those are just an example of those same receptors we were talking about. The pathogen-associated molecular patterns, these are the ones we typically associate with being body parts of organisms that invade our body, such as viruses, such as bacteria, those sorts of things. When you see myeloid differentiation primary response gene, just understand that after these toll-like receptors have been initiated on the surface of the cell, underpinning the mechanics intracellularly, there's this process called the myeloid differentiation 88. This is important just because this is going to connect to all the different parts of the inflammation driving system that make these chemicals that initiate so many of the different problems we have. The underpinnings of a lot of this information is just to understand that when I say the myeloid differentiation part controls and is involved in feedback of a lot of different metabolic processes. We don't need to go through and know all of those, just understand that we know now a lot of the different mechanisms, as you can see now. We also understand that this myeloid differentiation is involved with viruses, in some cases with how we have upregulation of different types of cancers. When we look at this and we talk about grand scheme about, as an example, type 1 diabetes, we now consider the fact that the gut flora play a major role in the ability of somebody to be susceptible to type 1 diabetes. It also has to do with whether the child was breastfed, formula fed, diet, sensitivity to certain glutens, antibiotics, and also the viruses that exist inside the mother as well as the viruses that the child is exposed to. It also is now well recognized that adequate vitamin D plays a specific part in the developing child as to whether or not they're susceptible to becoming a type 1 diabetic. There's one particular paper that note that providing 1,000 to 2,000 IUs to a vitamin D daily to a child prior to 1 year old all the way up to 4 years old, there was a noted 60% reduction in type 1 diabetes. So the point being is this myeloid differentiation factor is involved in a lot of the underpinnings of a lot of inflammatory things intracellularly, and that's what we began to understand some of these mechanisms. When you understand, when you see something like toll-like receptor and you see a ligand, just understand the term ligand is nothing more than saying a protein piece, a piece of fat of certain types. Different substances that can get in the body can initiate the activation of these receptors, which are called toll-like receptors. The next thing that you understand is that because of that downstream, that's where this myeloid stuff has an impact on it. So we now have 13 toll-like receptors that have been identified. Of those specific ones, we know do certain things. Important to understand that this nucleic factor kappa B is a big part of the underpinnings of a lot of the inflammation that's genetically driven, because this particular nucleic factor kappa B is going to program up the development of all sorts of these cytokines that are going to be released throughout into the system. And in fact, to understand that after many exposures, the sensitivity becomes such that now you have a problem with actually having something called an inflammasome develop intracellularly as a response to continual exposure to items that will drive this nucleic factor kappa B up. And in the underpinnings, this is where we start realizing there are many different receptors that we'll find out that are important to us when we talk about this. And some actually can bypass the typical way we think of the myeloid differentiation factor and use a different process. So the point that we want to understand is viruses of different types are going to have an impact that's going to jump into the cell and start trying to hijack the mechanisms that we use. Specifically, they're going to try to tell the protein production part, the endoplasmic reticulum, as well as to tell the mitochondria to provide energy, and the other building structures to take over genetically the development of a new virus. Principal part to this is to understand that calcium is still a large part of the intracellular signaling process. In fact, it's determined and called the primary secondary signaling system of a cell when you look at it, what happens inside of the cell. Because calcium is going to be the directing process that either makes for normal or abnormal processes in the cell. And these acute infections are going to have problems induced in part because the directing calcium is going to also be a part of what's being hijacked. So when you look at this in terms of Dr. Vasquez's explanation of how we should approach this, understand that total viral load is literally looking at the example of all the exogenous viruses we come in contact in our life. This is going to include the parvovirus that basically became a human virus when it crossed over because a dog that was infected with parvo also had another virus that was similar to the rhinovirus of a cold, and the subsequent virus produced was this parvo-19, which is referred to as Fifth's disease. This is the one where the child has real red face. This infection in adults can have negative consequences in ways that don't seem to manifest in everyone, just some people react very badly to it. Then you got the human papillomavirus, the Epstein Barr virus, cytomegalovirus. All these other viruses we know are exogenous that come in. Their importance is that all these viruses stay with us forever. And if they're allowed to continually run at a low-grade level of infection, the point being is we want to try to make sure we keep that from happening because there's negative consequences that have been identified, and I will get to that later. When you look at the endogenous viruses, you have to understand that in our own DNA given from our mother and father, we have bits and pieces of viruses that have been matrixed into the DNA. And as we were produced, that virus has become encoded inside of us. And so the problem with the virus is they all work pretty much the same in the fact that when they start to replicate, it has almost like a zombie effect of the Night of the Living Dead, if you would. All these viruses start to reanimate themselves. The reanimation of these viruses is an example of when you get stressed, and you'll notice that these viruses come back, say like the cold sore that you have, that periodically will disappear, and so you get sunburned, or if you get out in a real stressful situation, you have this cold sore pop back out again. That's the herpes simplex type 1 virus. You'll also notice that in the case of when you have, say, like a cold with a rhinovirus infection, and the rhinovirus takes off, and you notice that the cold sore comes back. So an initiation of that one viral infection that you've got now reanimates old viruses that you still have stuck inside of you. In the case of the herpes simplex virus, it resides in the trigeminal nerve. It's also been noticed to appear to project into areas up the cranial nerve, and it's believed to be associated in some cases with one of the things that is associated with more Alzheimer's problems in patients. This is one of the reasons you want to keep these viruses in check so they do not continue to run as a low-level inflammatory process. In the case of the bacteriophages, these are the viral infections that infect the colony of 2.5 to 3 pounds of bacteria that exist in your intestines. Those bacteria have viral infections, typical count being about 1,200 phages inside the residence of your intestines. Well, the problem is some cases when these virus populations become more abundant, in the case of certain metabolic stresses or certain dietary factors that allow for these viruses to become more abundant, that can prove to be a part of inflammation that makes enough problems and increases intestinal problems, and can have a driving effect even in some types of intestinal cancers. The toll-like receptors in the case of immunity end up being a big part in these viral infections because these toll-like receptors respond to certain viruses. You'll find that some of them are more common than others. Toll-like number 3 tends to work in an entirely different pattern. You'll also find out we'll be talking about crossover reactions, that when the virus has invaded inside the cell and then comes out of the cell with multiple things, the parts of the cell itself that was invaded will now give rise to more inflammatory reactions because of its initiation of toll-like receptor activity. So what you start looking at is some of the examples about hypermobility in intestines being associated with bacterial processes that grow, the particular types of gases those bacteria make, initiating a problem with actually stunning the mitochondrial function, so the intestinal mobility is basically being reduced, and even the fact it can have effect on hormone changes due to this continual process of the mobility being changed. All of this plays into the different effects these viruses and some bacteria are going to have their own little way of inducing more problems in the cytokine world that can set off these toll-like receptors, in some cases by molecular mimicry, in some cases just the oxidative stress that's produced. When you look at what happens in the case of, say, like the viruses we're talking about today, the coronavirus, we now know that as of today we have had about 8 different virus types, corona type 19, that have been produced, and these coronavirus type 19 are associated with the fact that they've been androgenic drift. So you've had someone be affected with a virus, they had another virus, and it slightly altered the virus into a new type manifestation. The processes where viruses go in and replicate and make themselves and reproduce are pretty much the same. The shape of the virus may be variant, but the mechanisms are all pretty much the same. So what you'll notice is that they'll go through and attach to a cell, they get into the nucleus of the cell, they'll integrate their DNA and RNA into the machinery of our DNA, RNA. So whether you're looking at the HIV, the influenza, polio, adenovirus, all of them work through very similar processes to recreate themselves. This process is being hijacked to make more viruses using your cellular machinery. So in our example here, say like we take one cell being hijacked, and that one cell then makes 80 viruses new inside that cell. And when the cell ruptures, they come out, and this process is then started. Well, we know now that there are certain things that affect how well our body can defend against viruses. We know that there are things that are in there that our system uses to be blocking the replication. We know that there are nutrients that either aid in their absence or suppress in their presence the ability of those viruses to continually going on unchecked. In the case of this process, complexes 1, 3, 4, and 5 are basically derived from your mother's DNA that provides for the construction of a mitochondria. The important parts of this is just remember that not all of the structure that's needing to be used to build a mitochondria come from your mother. This is part of that symbiotic relationship where your cells provide the material to make the 200 to 2,000 mitochondria that reside inside of each cell. The problem comes in that from an evolutionary standpoint, the mitochondria derives from a bacteria. So the DNA that's being used in this particular process has the bacterial DNA footprint and looks like the DNA of a bacteria. When, in the case of a viral infection, the cell is hijacked and the 80 or so virons that are being produced as the new parts of the new viruses, and that cell then releases it by being destroyed by the virus, that abruptly discharged viral initiated breakdown of the cell liberates all of this DNA, this mitochondrial DNA, through the damage-associated molecular pattern system. Your body picks up this as being damaged. But the problem comes in the fact that it's bacterial derived. It mimics that of a pathogen-associated molecular pattern, and in this case, it fits a specific type of receptor called toll-like receptor number 9, which resides on a white blood cell type called a neutrophil. The problem is when that neutrophil is now initiated into action by mitochondrial DNA and believes it to be bacterial DNA, it causes the mechanisms of all this chemotaxis to occur, and your body mobilizes massive amounts of now neutrophil white blood cells programmed to deal with a bacterial DNA problem that even though it's actually mitochondrial. And in the case of when this happens in the lung, this is where you have your lung tissue start making massive amounts of fluid and the migration of these white blood cells. And this whole process develops a supercharged reactive oxygen stress problem that then is going to initiate these inflammasomes type of reaction, and this is where you get the local inflammation becomes this massive overactivated infection. This problem tends to be greatly exaggerated in the absence of certain nutrients and seems to be sequestered when we have certain nutrients in place. If you look at this particular diagram, you'll understand why there are certain organisms that are associated with being able to cause pneumonia, such as a virus. But so can gram-negative bacteria, so can gram-positive bacteria, can a fungal infection can do this, and protozoa infections. So all of these are capable because they have DNA that is able to be reactivated on a toll-like receptor, number 9. You can have a fungal infection or a bacterial infection or even a protozoa type of thing that makes a pneumonia. In the case of this particular coronavirus we're dealing with, it's able to do it in a way that's pretty straightforward to understand. So what you're having is a crossover from a damaged molecular pattern being mistaken as a pathogen. To understand that we talk about mitochondrial vulnerabilities, on top of all that, having extra lead, manganese, cadmium, arsenic from rice, germ layer. Specifically in Louisiana, we have a problem that we've used so much arsenic for years to take care of boll weevils in the cotton, and unintentionally they've later discovered that rice is capable of picking that up and storing it in the germ layer. So when you take in brown rice per se, or you take in some degree of white rice, still has some left on it, but when you use, say, like brown rice syrup, it's actually concentrated, having more arsenic. Mercury becomes a problem when we realize that inorganic mercury has been associated with getting into high fructose corn syrup. When we realize that aluminum can be put into certain food products unintentionally and sometimes intentionally to aid in the development, say, of double action baking powder effects on baking. All of that gets in through this N-methyl-D-aspartate receptor and will go straight into the mitochondria, and can also be a contributory vulnerability problem for mitochondria, not to mention all the other environmental things we can have that cause problems. The importance of understanding when this process is happening in lung tissue, in our example before, this can also be systemic. In fact, it becomes multi-organ dysfunction to that same mechanism in case, say, in your intestines, where a virus will go and infiltrate the intestines. Those intestinal cells have lots of mitochondria, so that same process will associate itself with diarrhea. It's basically becoming a massive acquired mitochondrial dysfunction induced by the viral infection, causing the release of the mitochondrial DNA and initiating the reaction of your body saying, oh, I have a bacterial infection, and initiating that toll-like receptor number 9. Because all of these different processes are associated with the damage-associated molecular patterns, the pattern recognition receptors, all the different effects of the mitochondria, the lymphocytes, all of these are associated with the different chemistry associated with the mediators that cause the reactions. And this can become something that leads to complete circulatory system failure. It can cause the small circulatory capillaries in the body to not work properly. Obviously the lungs can be affected and you become incapable of breathing due to the pneumonia. It can cause ballistic diarrhea in intestines, cause the kidneys to shut down, the liver, as well as encephalitis, brain quit functioning. This becomes a multi-organ dysfunction system, and this is how these types of processes unveil rapidly in the clinical setting and hospitals where they're trying to take care of people. Normal healthy mitochondria we know quite a bit about now. We know also that there are things that can cause mitochondrial disruption, such as reactive oxygen stress problems. These can be part of the things we talked about in the first program, where we talked about all the environmental dietary factors that you can play that will have an effect on how healthy or unhealthy you are. These toxins, when they get into the system, or the depletion of the antioxidants that's seen, can be dealt with in some cases by adding certain nutrients into the system. Understand that the mechanism is better understood than it was ever before, because antioxidant depletion leads to more activation of the very NF-kappa B system we talked about that will enhance the ability of these viruses to replicate, survive. It also allows for the drifting to occur so you can get mutations and the immune evasion become worse, the exacerbations of viral infections, the molecular damage. This little small n is an example of where the cytokine storm becomes more profound in the absence of things to shut it down. Long-term effects of this viral infections, when it's not an acute case, can lead to these sort of problems that we think of with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, heart failure, hypertension, and even fibromyalgia due to the dysfunction that's caused to the mitochondria by a low-level chronic viral infection. Things that are done basically as described and laid out by Dr. Vasquez is the fact that there are things you can do that will make a difference to help keep your mitochondria in a healthier state. To understand what we look at in nutrition, there are certain things that have a background effect on helping have an antiviral effect. The literature is described in certain parts of different things in different types of viruses. It's been identified that these play a part. So selenium and zinc makes a difference in causing your body to have certain available minerals that tend to inhibit some of the inflammatory excessive that you see with some of the viral infections. Iodine presence and not being absent matters. The abundance of too many competitive halides can be a problem. Lysine in the case of like the cold sores or in the herpes simplex 2 in the genital region. Antiviral properties, we know that it's best to keep methylation levels high as opposed to having them low. Hypomethylation is associated with elevated levels of homocysteine. So when you have elevated levels of homocysteine, it's indicative of what we know already in the literature is associated with cardiovascular problems, and we understand the mechanisms where it deals specifically with initiating the gene activity of the P66SHC family, which when that gene is activated, it initiates problems in the endothelial lining of our arteries. But also now we understand that it's an indicative state of poor methylation, and hypomethylation in of itself leads to more abundant activities of the viruses, as well as having a more robust effect of developing cancer cells. We know now that things that we do that helps to keep our nucleic factor kappa B inhibited is beneficial. N-acetylcysteine has benefits because not only of its anti-replication effect, it also is a major support to the glutathione system intracellularly to reduce reactive oxygen stress. This is the same mechanism when you look at like vitamin C, works as a scavenger for reactive oxygen stress. Alpha lipoic acid, selenium, and zinc, beneficial again. Cancer and immune function has been known to be altered in the presence of more selenium. We know now that also having selenium as an adjunct is beneficial in viral infections and our defenses against bacterial infections. And we know that this is because of the fact that it's been seen in several studies that it's been an important fact to keep us from having a problem. This slide is an example of known vaccinations that they have identified that in the presence of these micronutrients, it helps the body to initiate a better immune response to these vaccines if adequate numbers of these particular nutrients are present. In the absence of known vaccines, we should probably realize that we've got at least 2 billion people that have identified that have multiple deficiencies of trace elements. Therefore, if we want to help with the individual as well as herd immunity, we should probably consider making sure that everyone has some of these trace minerals so they're better able to defend themselves against these viral infections currently we have, as well as general viral infections. The fact that we understand methylation plays a part in lots of different things is important, not just viruses and cancer. And to realize that these deficiencies make a difference. And there are things that we can do inexpensively for pennies that can be added into the general population without requiring some horrific amount of expenditure. Zinc, selenium, vitamin C, vitamin E, multiple vitamins, B vitamins, and these sorts, as well as copper, are often quite deficient in a large percentage of the population. And in the case when you have a hospital setting where someone's coming in, making sure that they have these nutrients would be the first line to help in this particular case. Just to understand methylation for a moment and realize it has to do with silencing of overactive genes. And this is important because a lot of these nutrients, we have shown that some people have single nucleic polymorphisms where they cannot encompass and make enough of these, such as the methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase deficiency that's been identified in the 23andMe program. Some people have the heterozygous, some people have the homozygous state, where because they have this, they have a problem making 5-methylfolate. That becomes an issue because this will cause an elevation in that homocysteine. Other things to realize is other nutrients can help sometimes with this, such as sulforaphane, the stuff out of broccoli. It's important to realize that when you look also in background understanding to appreciate what makes methylfolate really work well, is to understand that first of all, there's been identified 223 genes that are basically at the beck and call and requirement of vitamin D. Vitamin D deficiencies have been noted to be quite significantly present in a large percentage of the population, even those living inside of areas that are very well sunshined, let alone living, say, above in the area in the east where you're above the sunshine and you're not getting a good sunshine exposure anyway. So making sure that vitamin D levels are more than just adequate to do the job, because it's important to appreciate that the measure of vitamin D on most scalars read from something of 0 to 20 is deficient, 20 to 30 is insufficient, 30 to 100 is normal. That being understood, most people, unless they have some type of sarcoidosis or other problem, you'd want to have them up in the 60 to 80 range, because those levels basically make sure that methylation is going to be adequately done, because methylation is a component that requires the activation of some of these genes. It's also important to remember that low methylation has already been proven to lead to the low-level background activation of more Epstein-Barr virus and the human papillomavirus virus. The reason this is important is the human papillomavirus virus is associated with multiple different types of cancer, and if it's allowed to run unchecked by having hypomethylation in point, it increases those types of cancer expressions. In the case of Epstein-Barr virus, information is now known that we realize that it's associated with many different problems and pathologies due to the presence of low-level Epstein-Barr virus running in the background. And the fact that we know that if we have NF-kappa B kept in check by vitamin D, by all of these different compounds that have been identified. The fact that we know for a fact that many of these different processes are just nothing more than simple lipids that we need in our diet. We realize that EPA actually works as a fatty acid receptor, part of the proximal proliferator activator receptor alpha. Or the fact we realize that gamma-linolenic acid works as peripheral proximal activator receptor gamma. All of these are important to realize, and they're fairly inexpensive interventions that people can have that they use to help with viral infections in general. All of these different components play into the original realization about how this plays into the activations of viral infections becoming progressive. And the Inflammatory Mastery text is a great example of that book. This has also been published inside several of his textbooks, which provide great insight as to how mitochondria function, as well as antiviral strategy. I highly recommend anyone that wants to learn more about this read that. Understand also that emphasizing having a lower type carbohydrate diet is more beneficial, as well as these nutrients that are listed. Understand that coming out of the CDC just last year in February, the identification of all of these different components that Epstein-Barr virus can be involved in as a background is relatively new information, because to realize that it can have an effect inside the central nervous system, can be associated with viral meningitis, it can cause optic problems, and all of these different processes, and you realize Epstein-Barr virus prevalence is 90 to 95% of the population. So it's important to realize that all of these different types of processes we now know can be at the beck and call and behest of a low-level Epstein-Barr virus, because this virus never goes away. It's just if it's either activated in a low immune state where you're not doing a good job defending it. And the fact that all of these different type of processes are also there is all Epstein-Barr virus. And it's quite remarkable when you realize that this information has only recently been published in the last year. Also realize the fact that we now know that there are certain environmental chemicals that can increase the process of demethylation of DNA. Some of these being like BPA plastic, some of the environmental factors we did not realize could have an impact on methylation processes. And then to realize that this is fairly inexpensive things that can be done to help with this. But to realize that some medications we're now realizing have a part to play in causing demethylation, and they can also make the systemic lupus erythematosus induced drug type occur. And to realize that getting enough sleep, trying to avoid stress that's unnecessary, getting too much sugar that is not needed, and appropriate exercise will help with you keeping in better cell preservation. Realize we know now about 8 different herpes viruses that are common in humans. The type 1, the cold sore, most of us are familiar with. The type 2, the genital type herpes, most people are familiar with. But to realize that chickenpox, or the herpes zoster, is a herpes virus. And to realize it's present and it takes certain processes, and it's one of those viruses that once you've had it, you still have it in your residence, and that's how you see people that develop the zoster or shingles. Understanding that herpes 4 is typically the Epstein-Barr virus that we consider to be mono when we get something like that in our younger age, but it's also sometimes classified as the cytomegalovirus virus, is also called mono. They're not the same viruses, and they have different processes. They lead to possibilities as the consequences of their infections. The type 6 and type 7 are extremely common, and they see those, and the majority of people have been exposed to them. We now realize, such as the Epstein-Barr virus, the herpes 6, and pinworms appear to be associated with multiple sclerosis development. And then to look at herpes type 8, that is the particular one that's associated with HIV being associated with making the type of cancer called complex sarcoma. These are all these different viruses that we've begun to realize now that are basically herpes type viruses. And then to realize we have all these other viruses we've all been exposed to, or have caught, or maybe have vaccinated for, or maybe not. But the point being is, all of these don't respond as poorly in the presence of good background micronutrients, and they don't become as overwhelming. And we know this for a fact. We also know that the cytomegalovirus has been one that's been associated with several different problems, including lupus and including scleroderma. So to develop these processes, in many cases you have to have had these viral infections, and they run unchecked in the background. In the case of Epstein-Barr virus, the acute phase, we understand the sore throat, the significant fatigue and splenomegaly that occurs, but it's also been associated in the low background to be associated with setting up autoimmune diseases, such as systemic lupus erythematosus and multiple sclerosis. Thank you for your attention today. Hopefully you have found this useful and understand that micronutrients can be something you're taking and doing now as a preventative, as well as making sure you have adequate levels of vitamin D, have some extra vitamin C to help you defend yourself against all viral infections, not just coronavirus.
On August 11th and 12th of 2016, a stalled no-name storm dumped 31 inches of rain in southeastern Louisiana in 24 hours. 4 trillion gallons of water caused unprecedented levels of flooding in 5 parishes, and the estimated destruction of 40,000 homes and as many businesses. The members of United Associated Plumbers and Steamfitters Local 198 decided the right thing to do was mobilize a workforce to help its members, their families, neighbors, and others recover from the damages caused by the flood. Union members from surrounding communities.
Prayer helps a lot. Prayer helps a whole lot. If it wasn't for having faith in the Lord, you wouldn't have faith enough to be doing this. And good Lord willing, things will get back like they used to be.
In 2016, we one day woke up and had to realize that we are all the same. And by the grace of God, we're all going to be okay.
Let's not forget what happened here. Not with the devastation, but with the compassion, the support, and the caring and love that was given to this community in their time of need.
Louisiana is no stranger to adversity. People are helping one another heal, and the story of survival and success in the face of this flood will simply become a part of the proud history of a resilient culture. United Associated Plumbers and Steamfitters Local 198 appreciates, on behalf of its members, every person and organization that donated in some way to this effort.
Be alright, alright, my brother, it's gonna be alright, alright, it's gonna be alright, alright, my sister, it's gonna be alright. No matter how far down you are, my brother, you can be lifted up. With the flicker of a switch, your whole world can be relit up. Alright, it's gonna be alright. Alright, my brother, it's gonna be alright. It's gonna be alright, alright, my brother, I say alright, it's gonna be alright. Alright, my sisters, it's gonna be alright. The little children say A-L-R-I-G-T.